Captain Sarah Mitchell stood in the security line at Denver International Airport with her military uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass. 20 years of service to her country had taught her discipline in every aspect of her life, from the crease in her pants to the way she carried herself through crowded spaces. At 42 years old, with gray beginning to thread through her dark hair, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. She had just finished a 4-month deployment overseas. The medical discharge paperwork was in her carry-on bag, along with letters of commendation and a Purple Heart she hadn't asked for. Her body was healing. The shrapnel wound on her back had mostly closed up, though the surgeons said the scars would be there forever. That was all right with Sarah. She'd earned every mark. The flight attendant at the gate smiled politely as Sarah boarded. "Welcome to Flight 447 to Charleston. We're happy to have you." Sarah nodded, grateful for the kindness. Small courtesies meant something when you'd spent months in a place where kindness was a luxury. Her seat was in first class. An old friend from her platoon, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, had upgraded her as a surprise. He knew she was struggling with the transition back to civilian life. Flying first class, eating decent food, sitting in a comfortable seat, these seemed like small gifts, but they felt enormous to Sarah. She settled into her seat by the window, stowing her uniform cap in the overhead bin. The cream-colored seat was wide and inviting. Sarah felt herself relax for the first time in weeks. She was going home to Charleston, to the small house her mother had held on to all these years. That night, she would sleep in her childhood bed. That night, she could finally breathe. A woman about Sarah's age appeared in the aisle. She had blonde hair styled perfectly, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of expensive jewelry that didn't flash so much as whisper about serious money. She looked at her boarding pass, then at the empty seat beside Sarah. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying the edge of someone used to being obeyed. "There's been a mistake. I'm supposed to be in this seat." Sarah checked her ticket. "This is my seat. 4A. The woman didn't even look at Sarah directly. She turned to scan the cabin like she was searching for someone who could help. "Yes, well, I had this seat changed when I boarded. There must be some confusion." A flight attendant named Derek appeared almost immediately, as if the woman had summoned him by thought alone. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of eager-to-please energy that came from still being new to the job. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Hendricks?" he asked. "This passenger," she gestured vaguely toward Sarah without making eye contact, "seems to be in my seat." Derek looked at Sarah's ticket. Then he looked at Mrs. Hendricks. Sarah saw the calculation happen behind his eyes, the quick assessment of which passenger mattered more. The woman in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, or the woman in military uniform, sitting quietly and not causing trouble. "Ma'am," Derek said to Sarah, and his tone had changed completely. It was still polite, but it had lost its warmth. "I'm going to need you to move to seat 4C. It's just one row back." Sarah felt something harden in her chest. She had given 4 months of her life to her country. She had been shot at. She had held a friend who was bleeding out. She had missed her mother's 70th birthday. And now, on the one day she was supposed to rest, to be treated well, someone who had probably never sacrificed anything was taking that away. But Sarah had learned long ago that showing anger didn't help. It just made things worse. "Of course," she said quietly. She stood up and gathered her things. Mrs. Hendricks settled into seat 4A without acknowledging Sarah's departure. She didn't say thank you. She didn't even look at her. Sarah moved to 4C, which was in the middle of the first-class cabin. The seat was fine, comfortable, with good service. But it wasn't the seat she had been given. It wasn't the window seat where she could look at the sky and feel some measure of peace during the flight. As the plane took off, Derek brought the first-class passengers champagne and warm towels. He brought Mrs. Hendricks a special fruit plate she apparently hadn't ordered but had requested anyway. He was attentive and warm with her. When he came to Sarah, his service was perfunctory. A drink she hadn't asked for. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah sat back in her seat and watched the ground fall away beneath them. She thought about the dozens of times she had packed everything she owned into a rucksack. The hundreds of times she had slept on uncomfortable surfaces. The countless moments when she had gone without because her team needed resources more than she did. She had chosen to serve. She believed in that choice. But in this moment, at 35,000 feet, Sarah felt the weight of the last 20 years settle on her shoulders like a stone. Mrs. Hendricks turned to the woman on her other side and began talking loudly about a charity gala she was organizing. She didn't once look back at Sarah. The flight lasted 3.5 hours. Sarah ordered water. She declined meals. She pulled a book from her bag, a military biography, and read the same page 5 times without absorbing a single word. Her mind was elsewhere, turning over the injustice of the moment, trying to reconcile the person she had become with the person that woman had seen when she looked at her. Or rather, hadn't seen. Mrs. Hendricks hadn't really seen Sarah at all. When the plane began its descent into Charleston, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not anger, exactly. But a kind of resolve. She had spent 20 years being invisible when it mattered. Being overlooked. Being underestimated. Being taken for granted. Maybe it was time for that to change. As the wheels touched down on the tarmac, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Charleston. Thank you for flying with us today. We hope you enjoyed your flight." Sarah gathered her things as the plane taxied toward the gate. She straightened her uniform. She settled her cap on her head at just the right angle. She was going to walk out of this plane with her head high, because she had earned that right. But what she didn't know, what none of the passengers in first class knew, was that the pilot had just seen something on the security camera that would change everything that had happened on Flight 447. The captain's hand was already reaching for the intercom. And in just a few moments, Mrs. Hendricks' world was going to shift on its axis in ways she had never anticipated. Captain James Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for 32 years. He had flown through thunderstorms that made grown men pray. He had navigated emergency situations that textbooks said shouldn't happen. He had developed the kind of intuition that comes from tens of thousands of hours in the air, the ability to sense when something in his plane wasn't quite right. But he had never, in all his years, gone back to review cabin footage because of a suspicion about passenger behavior. That wasn't his job. That was the airline's job. Until today. As he was reviewing post-flight protocols in his office, a small space with a single desk and a window overlooking the tarmac, Captain Rodriguez had pulled up the routine cabin camera feeds, as he did every flight. It was habit. Most captains didn't bother. But he had been trained in the military, and military training taught you to stay aware of everything happening in your domain. That's when he saw her. The woman in the military uniform, moving from seat 4A to 4C. The fluid way she had complied without argument. The way she had then sat quietly, drawing no attention to herself, asking for nothing. In her profile, he could see the set of her jaw. The practiced calm. The kind of bearing that didn't come from just anywhere. And then, as she had stood up to move, the uniform top had shifted slightly, and he had caught a glimpse of her back. At first, it was just a partial view. But when she had bent slightly to stow something in the overhead bin, the angle had been perfect. A seal tattoo. The distinctive trident symbol that marked her as a member of one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. Captain Rodriguez had sat back in his chair, his heart rate increasing. A female Navy SEAL. Those were rare. Incredibly rare. The first woman had only gotten through the training a few years ago. And here was one, sitting quietly in first class, being moved from her seat by a woman in designer clothes. He had rewound the footage and watched it again. He watched the interaction between Mrs. Hendricks and the flight attendant. He saw the way Derek's demeanor had shifted the moment Mrs. Hendricks made her complaint. He saw the way Sarah had accepted the injustice without protest. That was what troubled him most. Captain Rodriguez was not a man who involved himself in airline customer service issues. That wasn't his responsibility. But he was a man who believed in honoring service. In recognizing sacrifice. In acknowledging those who had given their country their best years. He had picked up his phone and called the gate agent. "This is Captain Rodriguez," he said. "I need information about the passenger in seat 4A on today's flight to Charleston." The woman who had the seat changed. There had been some confusion about why the captain was asking. The gate agent had checked the passenger manifest. Mrs. Catherine Hendricks, the agent had confirmed. She's a frequent first-class passenger. Very particular about her seating preferences. And the passenger who was originally in that seat? Rodriguez asked. Captain Sarah Mitchell. Military passenger, flying on a military benefit ticket that was upgraded by another serviceman. Rodriguez had felt something crystallize in his chest. Captain. She was a captain. Which meant she had worked her way up through the ranks. Which meant she wasn't just a SEAL, she was a leader of SEALs. "Thank you," he had said, and hung up. For several minutes, he had sat in his office, his hands on his desk, thinking about what he had witnessed. About the dismissal. About the casual cruelty of it. About the fact that this woman, this captain who had presumably done things most people couldn't imagine, who had sacrificed in ways most people would never understand, had been treated like she didn't matter. And she had taken it. That was the thing that gnawed at him. Captain Mitchell had accepted the situation with what appeared to be complete grace. She hadn't argued. She hadn't demanded justice. She had simply moved and sat quietly and bothered no one. Rodriguez knew the military. He had served 16 years as a Navy pilot before transitioning to commercial aviation. He recognized that kind of stoicism. It wasn't weakness. It was a survival mechanism. It was the result of a culture that taught you that complaining was pointless, that you followed orders, that you took care of your team and yourself came last. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The airline had policies about customer service. They also had policies about treating military passengers with respect. Rodriguez was a captain, which meant he had authority on his aircraft. He also had a responsibility to all his passengers. He made a decision. He picked up his phone again and called the main airline office. "This is Captain James Rodriguez, Flight 447, he said when someone picked up. "I need to file a formal complaint about the conduct of one of our gate agents and the treatment of a military passenger today." What followed was a series of conversations that moved up the chain of command. Rodriguez explained what he had seen on the cabin footage. He explained the interaction. He explained that he had identified the passenger as a decorated military officer, a Navy captain, who had been treated disrespectfully. And he asked for the airline to review its policies and its personnel. The airline took it seriously. They had to. Captain Rodriguez was respected in the company. He had a perfect safety record. His word meant something. Within 2 hours, the airline's management had reviewed the footage themselves. They had seen what Rodriguez had seen. And they had begun the process of addressing it. But they had a problem. They didn't have Captain Mitchell's contact information beyond her destination airport. The system didn't include phone numbers for passengers, only verification that they had boarded and landed safely. It took 3 days and some creative problem-solving for the airline to locate her. She was staying in her mother's house in Charleston. She wasn't expecting any calls from the airline. When her mother knocked on her bedroom door on the 4th day and said there was someone from the airline on the phone, Sarah's first instinct was fear. Had she left something on the plane? Had something gone wrong? She picked up the phone in her mother's kitchen. "Captain Mitchell." The voice was warm and official. "This is Vice President of Customer Service Diana Westbrook with Pacific Airways. I'm calling to apologize. Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. What followed was an explanation of the investigation. The footage review. Captain Rodriguez's observations. The discovery that she was a Navy SEAL, a distinction the airline's research revealed made this incident particularly serious. We take the mistreatment of our military passengers very seriously, Diana Westbrook said. What happened to you on Flight 447 was unacceptable. It violated our company values, and it violated the respect that military service deserves. Sarah found herself struggling to speak. She had been so focused on moving on not letting the incident define her return home, that she hadn't expected anyone to care. She hadn't expected anyone to look back and see what had happened to her. There's more, Diana said. Captain Rodriguez wanted to reach out to you personally as well. But first, I want you to know that we have taken action. The gate agent has been terminated, pending full review. We are also reviewing Mrs. Hendricks' account with us. She will not be welcome on our flights again. After she hung up the phone, Sarah sat alone in her mother's kitchen for a long time. She looked out the window at the Charleston street she had grown up on. The live oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. The historic homes painted in soft colors. Someone had seen her. Really seen her. And they had done something about it. 3 days after the call from the airline, Sarah was sitting on her mother's front porch, watching the slow Charleston afternoon drift by, when her phone rang. The number was unavailable. She almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. Captain Mitchell. The voice was warm and unmistakably military, that particular cadence that came from someone who had spent decades speaking with authority and precision. This is Captain James Rodriguez. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Sarah's chest tightened. She recognized the name immediately. The pilot. The man who had apparently looked back. Captain Rodriguez, she said. Diana from the airline told me you were the one who noticed what happened. I did, he said. And I want to explain why I called it in, because I don't think the airline's explanation quite captures it. Sarah listened as he told her about the footage. About noticing her compliance. About seeing the tattoo on her back, that small symbol that meant she had done something fewer than 100 women in the entire United States had ever accomplished. I've been flying military transport for 16 years, Rodriguez said, and commercial flights for 16 more. I've seen soldiers of every rank and station. But I've never seen one treated the way you were treated. And I've never seen one accept that treatment the way you did. There wasn't much I could do, Sarah said quietly. The flight attendant made his decision. The woman wanted the seat. I wasn't going to make a scene. That's discipline, Rodriguez said. That's training. That's the result of understanding that some battles aren't worth fighting. But here's what I want you to know, Captain Mitchell. Some battles are worth fighting. And this one is. Sarah wasn't sure what he meant. The airline did the right thing, Rodriguez continued. But I'm calling you for another reason. I ran into a friend of mine at dinner 2 nights ago. His name is Colonel Michael Patterson. He's the military liaison for a major defense contractor in Charleston. And I told him about you. Sarah felt her stomach flip. She hadn't worked since her discharge. She wasn't sure she was ready to work. The doctors had said her wound was healing, but the nightmares were still happening. The hypervigilance was still there. The sense that the world was somehow louder and sharper than everyone else seemed to experience it. I'm not sure I'm ready, she began. He didn't ask for a job candidate, Rodriguez interrupted, but gently. He asked if you were the Sarah Mitchell who led Operation Coastal Guardian 3 years ago. Sarah was quiet. Operation Coastal Guardian was classified. The fact that it had a name and that Rodriguez's friend knew about it meant only one thing: the man he was talking about had access to military intelligence. How does he know? Sarah started. Because Operation Coastal Guardian saved American lives, Rodriguez said. All over the news about what didn't happen, because it didn't happen. But people in certain circles know what almost happened. And they know that a captain from SEAL Team 6 led the operation that prevented it. Colonel Patterson said that if you were that Sarah Mitchell, he wanted to talk to you. Sarah felt something shifting inside her. The dismissal on the plane. The disrespect. The casual assumption that she was nobody important. And now this. What does he want? She asked. That's for him to tell you, Rodriguez said. But I'll tell you what I think. I think someone in Charleston's defense community has been aware of what happened to you, and I'm not just talking about the plane incident. There are people who know about the things you've done. The real things. The classified things that made the world slightly safer. And I think they want to make sure that you're taken care of on your way home. Sarah's eyes felt hot. She had spent 20 years giving everything to her country. 20 years of sacrifice that most people would never know about. 20 years of keeping secrets that she would carry to her grave. And she had accepted that. She had made peace with the idea that she would never be publicly recognized. That was the job. That was the deal. But suddenly, someone in this small moment, a pilot who had noticed her on a cabin camera, who had cared enough to call it in, who had reached out to the right people, had shifted something. Colonel Patterson called her the next morning. Captain Mitchell, I've heard remarkable things about you, he said. Captain Rodriguez told me about your recent experience with the airline, and I want you to know that speaks volumes about your character. The way you handled an unjust situation with grace rather than retaliation. That's exactly the kind of officer we need. Exactly what do you need, sir? Sarah asked. We're building a new division, Patterson said. A consulting firm that works with defense contractors and military partners to develop strategy and train personnel. We're looking for experienced military leaders, the real thing, not former officers trying to profit off their rank. The kind of people who actually know what they're talking about. He paused. I've cleared with the appropriate channels, he continued, and I can tell you that your service record is exemplary. The operations you've led. The decisions you've made. The people you've trained. That matters. It should matter. And frankly, this community in Charleston would be privileged to benefit from your expertise. Sarah felt something catch in her chest. I'm not sure I'm ready to work, she said. I'm not asking for an answer today, Patterson said. I'm asking you to think about it. And I want you to know something else. What happened on that plane with Mrs. Hendricks doesn't represent how most people see you or understand your value. Mrs. Hendricks saw someone in a uniform she didn't respect. The rest of us see something very different. After they hung up, Sarah sat for a long time, looking at her phone. She thought about Mrs. Hendricks, probably sitting in another first-class cabin on another airline, never knowing that her casual cruelty had set something in motion. Never understanding that the woman she had dismissed without a second thought was someone whose work had affected the security of the entire nation. Sarah had never cared what people thought of her. That wasn't why she served. But this was different. This was seeing herself recognized by her peers. By people who understood sacrifice. By people who understood what it meant to be chosen for something dangerous and important. She called her mother. I might have a job interview, she said. Her mother, who had waited 20 years for her daughter to come home, who had watched Sarah leave at 22 to join the Navy and leave again at 26 to join an even more elite unit, understood immediately that something was changing. Tell me everything, her mother said. As Sarah explained about Captain Rodriguez and Colonel Patterson, about the incident on the plane and the way it had somehow led to recognition, her mother began to cry. You should be proud of yourself, her mother said. I've been proud of you every single day. But maybe now you can be proud of yourself too. She had other things to worry about. Her charity gala was coming up, and the caterer had just informed her that they couldn't source the specific kind of lobster she demanded. There was also the matter of the garden party planned for the spring, and her designer was being impossibly difficult about the new dress she wanted commissioned. The call from Pacific Airways came while she was in the middle of a manicure. "Mrs. Hendricks? This is Diana Westbrook with Pacific Airways. I'm calling with some important news regarding your account." Catherine had initially been irritated by the interruption. Then she had become confused when Diana explained that the airline was reviewing an incident from Flight 447. "An incident?" Catherine asked. "I was perfectly happy with the flight. The service was excellent. The seat they gave me was exactly what I wanted." "That's actually what I'm calling about," Diana said. Her voice had taken on a different quality, still professional, but with an edge of something else. "The seat you requested was originally assigned to Captain Sarah Mitchell, a decorated Navy SEAL and military discharge passenger. You had her removed from that seat without justification." Catherine felt her face flush. "I had already requested a seat change before she boarded. It's not my fault if there was confusion with the seating arrangements." "According to our records," Diana said coolly, "there was no seat change requested until you made the complaint to our flight attendant. Captain Mitchell had the seat assigned to her as an upgraded benefit. You requested the change only after learning that she was occupying the seat you preferred." Catherine opened her mouth to defend herself, but Diana continued. "We have reviewed the cabin footage," Diana said. "We have reviewed the boarding records. And we have determined that our flight attendant, Derek Paulson, made an error in judgment by accommodating your request without verifying the facts of the situation." Catherine felt a flutter of anger. She was a valuable customer. She flew international flights multiple times per year. She spent significant money on airline tickets. She was used to having her preferences accommodated. "I don't see what the problem is," Catherine said coldly. "I prefer an aisle seat when I fly. The attendant accommodated my preference. It was a simple matter of customer service." "The problem," Diana said, "is that you displaced a United States military officer, a captain and a Navy SEAL, without justification, based on nothing more than your personal preference. Your preference was not more important than her right to the seat that had been assigned to her. And your behavior, according to our review, was disrespectful and dismissive." Catherine's hand trembled slightly. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever challenged her about her choices. "I'm going to have to ask you," Diana said, "to refrain from flying with Pacific Airways in the future. We will be mailing you a formal notice, but I'm informing you now that your frequent flyer miles have been forfeited, and your account has been suspended." The line went dead. Catherine sat in the nail salon, her hands still wet from the manicure polish, unable to move. It got worse from there. The local Charleston paper picked up the story somehow. Maybe someone at the airline leaked it. Maybe someone in Captain Rodriguez's network mentioned it. But suddenly, Catherine Hendricks' name was attached to a headline, "Local woman ejected from flight for mistreating military officer." The story described the incident accurately. It described Captain Mitchell as a Navy SEAL, though there were limits to what could be disclosed about her service record. It described Mrs. Hendricks' dismissal from the airline in less charitable terms than she would have chosen. But worse than the newspaper story was what happened on social media. Catherine wasn't particularly active on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. She was 54 years old and preferred to keep her social life offline. But she did have a Facebook account, and within 48 hours of the newspaper story being published, her account had been flooded with comments. People from Charleston. People who had military connections. People who had served or had family members who served. They all had the same message: Catherine Hendricks was disrespectful. She was ungracious. She was someone who had never sacrificed anything and had shown contempt for someone who had given everything. More damaging were the comments from people in her own social circles who began to distance themselves. Sandra Whitmore, a friend of 30 years, didn't return her calls. When Catherine finally cornered her at the grocery store, Sandra was polite but cold. "People are saying very unflattering things about you," Sandra said. "The military community in Charleston is quite close-knit. And frankly, Catherine, The way you treated that officer was embarrassing. It's embarrassing for all of us. The Hendricks name carried weight in Charleston. Catherine's family had money. Old money. The kind of money that came from businesses established in the 1980s and 1990s, during the economic boom. Catherine had always assumed that wealth and social standing were permanent. That they came with a kind of immunity. But what she was learning was that social standing was actually quite fragile. It was only secure if people agreed to keep respecting you. And people were no longer agreeing. The charity gala she had been planning for 3 months was quietly cancelled. Not officially cancelled by her, but her venue called to say they had a problem with the catering contract, and then her designer called to say she was overextended, and then her committee members began suggesting that perhaps we should postpone until next year. Catherine understood what was happening. She was being shunned. It was then that she realized something that struck her with force. The thing that mattered most to Catherine, the thing she had built her entire identity around, was the approval of other people. And she had lost it. She had lost it over a seat on an airplane. One night, about a week after the initial call from the airline, Catherine found herself scrolling through the newspaper article again. She read about Captain Sarah Mitchell. About her service as a Navy SEAL. About the fact that she had been medically discharged due to injuries sustained during her final deployment. Catherine found herself thinking about what it meant to dedicate your entire life to something bigger than yourself. To spend decades in service to your country. To risk your life repeatedly. To come home injured and damaged. And then to be treated without respect by someone like Catherine. She made a decision that surprised her. She called the airline and asked if it was possible to reach out to Captain Mitchell directly. Diana Westbrook, the VP of Customer Service, was hesitant. "I'm not sure Captain Mitchell is interested in personal contact regarding this matter," she said carefully. "I want to apologize," Catherine said. And she meant it. There was a pause. Then Diana said, "I can pass along a message if you like." Catherine wrote a letter. It took her 3 hours to write something that felt genuine, that felt like enough, that felt true. She apologized for her behavior. She apologized for not seeing Captain Mitchell as a person worthy of respect. She acknowledged what it meant to serve in the military, and the fact that she herself had never sacrificed anything compared to the sacrifices that service required. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just offered her genuine remorse. When Sarah received the letter, forwarded through the airline several weeks later, she read it once and then set it aside. The apology was nice. It was better than nothing. But it didn't change what had happened, and it didn't change the way Catherine had looked at her, or rather, hadn't looked at her, that day. What mattered more to Sarah was that the entire experience had shown her something she needed to see. It had shown her that there were people in the world who valued what she had done. Who understood sacrifice. Who were willing to stand up and call out injustice even when it wasn't their problem to solve. 6 months after the incident on Flight 447, Sarah Mitchell stood in a conference room on the 23rd floor of a gleaming office building in downtown Charleston. The room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. The table was made of polished wood. The coffee was expensive. She was now the Vice President of Strategic Operations for Patterson Defense Solutions, a consulting firm that worked with the U.S. military and private defense contractors to develop training programs and strategic solutions. Colonel Patterson sat at the head of the table, a man in his 60s with the bearing of someone who had commanded troops and made decisions that affected national security. Across from him were representatives from 3 branches of the military, as well as officials from the Department of Defense. They were there to discuss a proposal that Sarah had developed over the past 5 months. The problem, Sarah was saying, is that we train our operators, especially our elite special forces, to be exceptional at combat. But we don't adequately train them for the transition back to civilian life. That gap is what leads to high rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and suicide among military personnel. She clicked to the next slide, which showed statistics that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. What I'm proposing, Sarah continued, is a comprehensive program that integrates mental health support, career transition coaching, and community reintegration training into the discharge process. Not as separate components, but as an integrated whole. Because that transition, from being a warrior to being a civilian, is one of the most difficult things a person can go through. An admiral in the room leaned forward. Captain Mitchell, this is excellent work. How did you develop this particular focus? Sarah had prepared for this question. She had decided in advance how much to share. From personal experience, she said. I was discharged 6 months ago due to combat-related injuries. And I discovered that the hardest part wasn't the physical healing. It was the sense of identity loss. I had spent half my life being defined by my service. Suddenly, that identity was gone, and I wasn't sure who I was anymore. That's what I'm trying to address with this program. She didn't mention the flight. She didn't mention Mrs. Hendricks or the dismissal from first class. Those details weren't relevant to the program. But they were embedded in the reason she had done this work, in the moment she had realized that being underestimated and dismissed had shown her something important about what the world needed. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the Admiral spoke. Captain Mitchell, on behalf of the Navy, I want to thank you for your service. And I want to commend you for this work. Because what you're describing isn't just about individual soldiers. This is about national readiness. If we can help our people transition successfully back to civilian life, we reduce a significant burden on the Department of Veterans Affairs. We reduce homelessness among veterans. We reduce suicide rates. This is the kind of work that actually saves lives. Over the next hour, they discussed implementation. They talked about funding, pilot programs, training requirements. Sarah found herself in her element, talking strategy, making decisions, drawing on the skills she had developed across 20 years of military service. When the meeting ended, the officials from the Defense Department remained behind. Captain Mitchell, one of them said, an older man named Deputy Director Hammond, there's something else we wanted to discuss with you. Privately. Sarah's administrative assistant left the room, and it was just Sarah and Hammond. I've reviewed your service record, Hammond said. The operations you led. The decisions you made. The training you provided to other personnel. I want you to know that the Defense Department is aware of your contributions, even if the general public is not. Sarah waited. This was something different from what they had discussed in the meeting. There's a decoration that was held back from your discharge ceremony, Hammond continued. It was classified at the time, and the operation it recognized was still sensitive. But we've been given clearance to move forward with it now. If you're interested, we'd like to hold a private ceremony, small, just key military personnel, to recognize your leadership during Operation Coastal Guardian. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. She had never expected this. She had accepted her discharge. She had accepted that she would never be publicly recognized for certain aspects of her service. That was the deal with classified operations. What kind of decoration? She asked. The Distinguished Service Medal, Hammond said. For exceptional service to the nation during a critical operation. It's one of the highest honors the military can bestow. Sarah's eyes burned with tears that she wouldn't let fall. I'm honored, she said. The ceremony took place 2 weeks later, in a small conference room at the Naval Station in Charleston. There were perhaps 30 people present, military officers, some of Sarah's former colleagues, Colonel Patterson, and Captain Rodriguez, who had been invited as a guest of honor for his role in bringing attention to Sarah's service. When the citation was read, it described Sarah's leadership without revealing the details of what had been accomplished. The language was formal and precise, for exceptional leadership and strategic thinking during a critical operation that prevented threats to national security and protected American lives. When the medal was pinned to her chest, Sarah thought about the flight. About Mrs. Hendricks. About the moment she had been dismissed as if she didn't matter. She thought about how the universe sometimes has a way of correcting those moments. Not through revenge, but through recognition. Through the quiet acknowledgement of the people who actually see you. After the ceremony, as people were mingling and congratulating her, Captain Rodriguez pulled her aside. "I want you to know something," he said. "That day, when I saw you on the cabin footage, moving from that seat without protest, I recognized something in you. I recognized someone who understood that strength isn't about demanding to be treated well. Strength is about accepting injustice without letting it diminish you." "Is that what I did?" Sarah asked. "That's what you did," Rodriguez said. "And then, after the airline reached out to me, when they told me who you were, I understood why you had accepted it so gracefully. Because you'd had decades of practice. Decades of doing things that mattered and never being able to tell anyone about them. You'd learned to find meaning in your service itself, not in recognition." He smiled. "But I think it's nice that you're getting some recognition now," he said. "Not because you need it, but because you deserve it." That evening, Sarah drove to her mother's house and found her sitting on the front porch, as she often was in the late afternoons. Sarah sat beside her, and they watched the light fade over Charleston. "How was the ceremony?" her mother asked. "Meaningful," Sarah said. Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. "Do you know what I've been thinking about?" her mother said. "That woman on the plane. That Mrs. Hendricks. I've been thinking about what she's going through now, with everyone in Charleston upset with her. And I've been thinking about how much smaller her world has become." Sarah hadn't thought of it that way. She had been so focused on her own vindication that she hadn't considered Mrs. Hendricks' perspective. "Your world just got bigger," her mother continued. "You went from being dismissed as invisible to being recognized as essential. But she went the other way. And I think that's actually the more interesting story." Sarah considered this. "Do you think she's learned something?" Sarah asked. "I think," her mother said carefully, "that she's learned that the things we actually value, respect, inclusion, admiration, those things are earned through kindness and recognition of others' worth. She spent her whole life thinking that money and status were permanent. That they meant she could treat people however she wanted. But now she knows better." "That's a hard lesson," Sarah said. "The best lessons usually are," her mother replied. A few days later, Sarah made a decision. She sat down and wrote a letter to Catherine Hendricks. Not an angry letter. Not a cruel letter. Just a letter from one person to another. She wrote about what service meant. About the fact that some of what she had done would never be known publicly, and that was all right, because she had done it for the right reasons. She wrote about the moment on the plane, about how it had hurt, but about how it had also led to something unexpected. And she wrote about forgiveness. "What happened between us on that flight was a moment," Sarah wrote. "Just a moment. It doesn't define you, just as being dismissed in first class didn't define me. What defines us is what we do after those moments. Whether we learn. Whether we grow. Whether we choose to see the world with more compassion." She included a link to an article about Patterson Defense Solutions and the new transition program for military personnel. She included information about how Catherine might support the program if she was interested. She didn't expect a response. But she wanted to extend a hand across the divide that the incident had created. And then she moved forward with her life. Months turned into years. Sarah's transition program became a model for how the Department of Defense approached retiring military personnel. She was invited to speak at universities and military academies about leadership during times of change. She worked with other veterans to build communities of support. She never became famous. The work she did was important, but it was mostly invisible to the general public. But that was all right. Sarah had learned long ago that the most important work often happened quietly. One afternoon, almost 3 years after the flight, Sarah was speaking at the Naval Academy when a woman approached her after the presentation. Sarah recognized her immediately, though she had aged somewhat since the last time Sarah had seen her, on cabin footage from Flight 447. It was Catherine Hendricks. "Captain Mitchell," Catherine said. I wanted to thank you in person. Sarah was surprised, but she kept her face neutral. For what? She asked. For your letter, Catherine said. For offering grace when you didn't have to. And for creating this program. My grandson was military, Marine Corps. He came home with severe PTSD, and I didn't know how to help him. But after I read about your program, I connected him with a mentor through your transition initiative. He's doing so much better now. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. I'm glad, she said simply. Catherine extended her hand. I was wrong on that plane. I was cruel without meaning to be, because I didn't see you as a person. I just saw an obstacle to what I wanted. I think about that moment a lot. And I think about how you chose to respond with kindness instead of bitterness. That's taught me more than anything else in my life. Sarah shook her hand. We're all learning, Sarah said. We're all just trying to do better. After Catherine left, Sarah stood for a moment, looking out at the midshipmen gathered in the auditorium, each of them at the beginning of their own journey of service. She thought about the cascade of moments that had led her here. The dismissal on the plane. The pilot who had cared enough to look closer. The military community that recognized her service. The opportunity to build something that could help people. One small moment of injustice had somehow become the beginning of something meaningful. Sarah walked back to the podium to answer more questions from the students, carrying with her the knowledge that transformation often begins in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it starts with a seat on an airplane. Sometimes it starts with someone choosing to look closer. And sometimes it starts with choosing grace over bitterness, even when bitterness would have been justified.